Okay, everybody, welcome to Mentor Meetup here at the Student Startup Center, the Digital Student Startup Center. I'm thrilled today that we get a longtime friend of the center, and Nitin Gupta is going to speak to us. Nitin is a serial entrepreneur, a Davis alum, most recently built a company called Fairy that has since been acquired. We're going to let Nitin tell his story, though. I'm not going to introduce him more than that, other than to say the guy is phenomenal, full energy, and somebody that you should all get to know well. Nitin, you take it away. You do what you want to do. We're here to follow your lead. So whatever direction you want to go, time is yours. Let's give a round of applause to Nitin Gupta.
Cool. Awesome. So I was in your shoes, right? I'm a Davis alumni, right? So a long time ago, but I totally understand how you guys are feeling. You know, when I was graduating Davis, I didn't go directly into entrepreneurship, right? So I was an electrical engineering major and an economics major. And at that time, I wanted to do something so far away from both of them that I ended up going to law school, right? So to get into law school, actually, all you have to do is take your LSATs, right? And, you know, that's different than, let's say, medical school, for example, where I think you have to have some prerequisites and all that good stuff. So went to law school, and then if you had an engineering major and went to law school at that time, there was opportunities for intellectual property litigation. So did that for a couple of years, but, you know, deep down inside, always wanted to become an entrepreneur, right? So after a couple of years of practicing law as a litigator, then started my first company. And, you know, when you think about starting companies, right, I think I was maybe more on the kind of like delusional level, right? Where I said, hey, look, I'm going to quit my job. I'm just going to go for it, right? And, you know, when you think about entrepreneurship, you really have to think about the situation that you're in, right? And, you know, when I say that, it's about your personal situation, it's about your financial situation, it's about where you are kind of in your career or whatnot, because, you know, you have entrepreneurs who are young, right, who just graduate college, all the way from entrepreneurs being in their mid-40s, mid-50s, and so, right? So you got to think about entrepreneurship from a situation where you're at, right? And, you know, also for entrepreneurship, you know, when I started my first company, I really approached it as solving a pain point, right? And I think you're going to hear this a lot, right? Like, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Because, you know, at the end of the day, you know, if you're not passionate about the problem you're trying to solve, entrepreneurship is hard, right? You have to have a higher kind of mission in terms of why you're pursuing what you're pursuing, right? So for me, for example, the first company that I started was a company that really addressed and democratized the professional services industry that allowed consumers like, you know, you and I, small businesses to be able to, you know, connect with professional service providers who were super expensive. And, you know, for me, that really hit a pain point because when I was a lawyer and I, you know, was charging folks, the billable hour or the amount that we were charging folks was, you know, pretty high. And, you know, that really led to poor representation and underrepresentation for a lot of consumers and small businesses, right? So that being said, you know, when you think about entrepreneurship, you really got to think about, okay, hey, look, like what kind of problem are you solving, right? So I think three things. So one is basically the situation that you're in. Number two is, you know, the problem that you're trying to solve. And number three, before I kind of like, you know, open it up in a sense, and, you know, you guys can gear me in terms of, you know, where you want me to talk about, you know, entrepreneurship is really a mindset as well, right? It's super scary. It's super frightening. Taking that jump, right, in almost the deep end. But on the flip side, it's liberating, right? It's, you know, it's creative, right? It's almost limitless in a sense, right? So, you know, when you think about entrepreneurship, the third point that I'm trying to make is it's really about the mindset that you have. And frankly, you know, to get that mindset, you know, and that's why I'm so, you know, I'm always happy to talk to Aaron and company and, you know, participate and, you know, whatever I can do. You know, Aaron definitely has that mindset, right? That encourages people to be entrepreneurs. And this forum that you have right now in the class, you know, at Davis, we didn't have that when we were around, like we didn't have that, right? And what this is really doing is this is really allowing a group of like-minded folks to come together and not only talk about entrepreneurship, but almost get a head start on entrepreneurship because of all the learnings that Aaron shares with you and because you're around people, right? So I think it's so awesome what you guys have right now. And it's such an amazing head start to whatever path you want to pursue, right? So whatever Aaron's doing is just, it's amazing. It's really, it's almost life changing, right? Like, again, like just to emphasize, starting two companies, I didn't have that experience when I was at Davis, right? I didn't learn about how to, and we were joking about this, Aaron, like I didn't learn how to even spell the word entrepreneurship until my late 20s, so.
The rest of us, if you can spell it already, so.
That's kind of it. Admittedly, I didn't know anything about starting anything and anything when I started my first company, right? I just didn't know. I literally just jumped in the deep end and went from there. And, at that time, the first company that I started was in 2009, right? No, actually it was in 2000. Yeah, it was in 2009. And that was literally a decade ago. And there was not that much material online, right? There was no YouTube videos, there was no podcast, there was no literature, there was no articles, no blogs, nothing. And it was literally about me, right, and my co-founder, who I knew as a kid, coming together and just saying, hey, look, let's start this company. And, our schedules literally were like, I would come to his house because we were working out of his house. I would come around 9:00 and then leave around 6 p.m., come back, and then go back at 9 p.m., right? With a little intern that we were working with. And then I would leave around like 1 p.m., right? So, working that many hours, we thought that was a recipe to success, right? But that's not necessarily the case in a sense, right? So, I think now it's a whole different ballgame, right? Because obviously you have folks like Aaron, you have so much information online as well, right? About sales, about marketing, about product development, right? About hiring, about, recruiting and all that good stuff. And, the ability to connect, let's say, with investors or whatnot, right? So I think, for me to answer your question, coming in, I kind of wish I focused really deeply on solving the customer's pain point, right? And when I say that, really understanding the problem and the pain point for the customer, right? Like, what is the pain point and the problem that we're trying to solve? And then, really focusing on not even scaling super quickly. And Aaron and I always have this conversation, like it's not about like, scaling stuff like very, very quickly and breaking things initially, right? Like you really have to understand and take the time and be thoughtful about what type of problem that you're trying to solve, and then make sure that you delight that customer, right? And it can be like one customer, two customers, three customers, 10 or whatever like that. But just make sure that like that customer appreciates your product and is solving such a huge, value, is such a huge pain point for them that they're not going to go and they're going to use you, and then they're going to start telling folks about you, right? So I think, for us, admittedly, when I first started my first company, I didn't unfortunately have that mentality, right? It was almost like, cool, I'm starting a company. This is awesome. Okay, let me just do like 10, 15, 20 different things. And, in hindsight, I think honestly, the approach would have been, hey, look, what's the problem that I'm trying to solve? Like what's going on? And that's why I think, when I started my second company, right, it was only after about 3 co-founders and almost 5 to 6 different projects that I started my second company. And, when I say that, it was all about experimenting with different projects and understanding whether I was solving a pain point for a customer. And you have to be, and this is where, Aaron and company, and you guys have so many resources, you almost have to be brutally honest with yourself, right? There's one aspect in which when I was a first-time entrepreneur, I was almost kind of believing my own hype, right? I was like, oh yeah, this is really solving this customer pain point, and, we're growing. But then there's this other side where, when I started my second company, I'm like, okay, hey, look, like, is this really addressing a customer's pain point, right? That's why I went through multiple projects, but then also from a co-founder standpoint, right? Luckily, I lucked out like on both of them where I had like great co-founders, but that's very important too, right? Like you really, if assuming that you are starting a company with someone else, it's literally a marriage, right? I mean, it's probably even more deeper than a marriage. And it's interesting, right? Like I've been, at it like 2 times now, and like, it just consumes you, right? Like you're thinking about it all the time, and there's a lot of sacrifices you have to make and whatnot, right? For me, because I was a lawyer, I kind of understood the pain points that existed amongst lawyers and customers. And because I was like actually there, that it kind of helped me out. I wasn't starting all the way from scratch, right? So that kind of accelerated my learnings and my understanding of the type of pain point that I want to solve. And that's what they say, right? Like the easiest way to actually, not the easiest way, but like a lot of people start companies to address a pain point that they have themselves, right? And you think about it like Instacart, for example, right? Instacart, who we know really well, they basically, the founder started the company because he just literally, like, he hated going to the grocery store, right? Like he just hated to do that, right? Ferry, for example, the company that I started, the second company, it's like, my wife and I used to fight like all the time. We're like, hey, look, who's going to do the dishes, right? Who's going to clean, right? So it's almost a personal pain point, right? So once you, once you identify that problem, then you talk to as many people as you can, right? And there's an idea of, a lot of people had, even when I had a first company, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't tell anyone my idea. People are going to steal it. But the reality of the matter is, the idea that you thought of, it's likely that 5 to 10 other people already thought of it already, right? Because the way this works is it's all about execution, right? So what I would do is I would get an idea, that solves a problem, and then I would talk to people, and you got to be thoughtful about the people that you talk to too, right? So if you talk to your mom and dad, for example, right, they're probably going to encourage you and be like, yeah, like that's a great idea. But if you talk to thoughtful people like Aaron, for example, or others, they're going to give you a more thoughtful perspective, right, and an honest perspective, right? So the way I looked at it is like I had as many conversations as which I wanted to hear at least 10 people saying no, right? And super disagreeing with the idea, and then clearly understanding them why. And I think that's like a decent threshold, right? Like, trying to talk to as many people as you can and make sure that at least a minimum of 10 people like do not agree with your idea and challenge your idea. Because then you're really going to start understanding kind of like, what you're going to start understanding whether this has legs. And then finally, a lot of people just talk about ideas, right? You probably hear a lot of people when something comes out in the article or, in the newspapers and say, oh yeah, I thought that was my idea, or I thought of that, So, you don't want to be one of those folks, right? Where what you want to do is after you talk to people, like you want to get it out there, right? In a very controlled manner to see how people are using it and to get feedback on that front, right? So that's the way I would approach it. I think it's kind of just going eyes wide open in. I think to expect like entrepreneurship is like a 9-to-5 job. It's not the case, only because it's not about like, there's again, different schools of thoughts. And Aaron, I would love to hear your perspective after this, but like, there's some schools of thoughts where it's like, hey, you have to work like 80 to 100 hours a week, right? And that's how you're going to like, make it, be successful. And then there's other aspects in which like, hey, look, it's about kind of like, how thoughtful you are, right? And for me, what I've kind of like realized was that, regardless of whether you work hard or if you like, work kind of like, your limited hours or whatever viewpoint you have on that, I think entrepreneurs in general think about the problem, right, all the time, even though they might not be working on it, right? So it's really time consuming, right? Because to really crack entrepreneurship, like you have to be like thinking about it, right? Obviously you're going to have your breaks, but it consumes you, right? Because you're always thinking about, okay, how can I solve this problem? How can I make this customer better? How can I make my employees better? How can I market? Like whatever it is, you're always thinking about your business, right? And then you think about it, right? Let's say you have a boyfriend, a girlfriend, let's say you have a husband, wife, or whatnot. obviously they need attention as well, right? So it's really about having an open and honest conversation with your significant other or with the person that you're dependent on. And when I started my first company, I didn't have a family, right? I didn't have a wife or kids or whatnot, right? So I think at the end of the day, it's almost like I feel like it's just something that needs to be communicated, right? Assuming that you have a significant other, where it's like, hey, look, this is a part of me now, right? That's kind of almost how you have to act like it. But the good news is there's so many people who do it, right? There's so many people who are able to successfully do it. Obviously, it's challenging, but I think the advice and the recommendation there is just to understand and go in eyes wide open in terms of, hey, look, like this is going to consume you, right? Not in a bad way, in a good way, but it's definitely going to consume you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think there's very few things that anyone can do effectively 100 hours a week. You're going to wear yourself out, exhaust yourself. Not to say there aren't ever times when you're that swamped and slammed. But I think, as someone who's speaking philosophically here, because I've never launched a company like Nitin has, but it strikes me as one of the big challenges I've seen for many of my entrepreneurs is the lack of mental break as opposed to, whether or not you're on the clock. Because when something is yours and you own it and the buck stops with you, then yeah, it's going to be in your head all the time. And you have to be really good about what that means for your own productivity at work, but also what it means for how you interact with your loved ones, your significant others, whomever they might be. Because it can be a strain and a stress, and you just have to know what your priorities are and how you'd approach all of those things. That's kind of my take.
I think it's almost like there's so many mistakes that I made and people make. I mean, it's just like, if you have a checklist of like 1,000 things, it's probably like, more than that, right? You just make a lot of mistakes, right? And I think, again, I think if I were, let's say like, I don't regret anything in terms of like, what happened or like how to go down. But I think, again, like a couple of things, it kind of relates to that first point, right? Where it's like, really understanding the customer pain point, right? And really understanding or really being passionate about it, right? And then again, like that third point in terms of like having that mindset, right? So, I believe I'm fortunate enough to have had the mindset of not fearing to start a company, right? A lot of people for, for good sake, find it scary, which it is. I mean, just think about it. You're going to start a company. You're not going to take a salary. You're going to be working 3 times harder. You're not going to have that much flex. Like, you don't know what's going to happen, right? It's pretty crazy. It's pretty delusional, right? So, I'm thankful that like, early on in my career, I had that mentality, right? And I think again, for you guys, what's awesome is that you guys are already talking about entrepreneurship in college, which is great, and for me to say, I'm thankful that I had this mentality starting in my late 20s is almost an understatement compared to you guys, which you guys are already having this conversation in college, right? So you guys are already around folks who literally are talking about entrepreneurship, right? So I think one thing I would just encourage you to think about is there's going to be so many people who tell you not to do it. So many people. They're going to look at you, and if you are doing it, they're going to be like, wow, why are you doing it? Right? That just comes with like the game. But what you really want to do is look at it as, you almost want to just stay in your own lane, right? You have your own destiny, right? You're destined to do whatever you're destined to do. And it's not about what the other person has done, whether they have done it quicker or faster than you, or whether they have done it a different way than you, right? Like, you just got to focus on your dreams. You got to focus on yourself, and you got to focus on believing in like achieving and, dreaming. Right. And I feel like, I'm just thankful that I didn't look at other people's kind of career paths or other people's like, careers. And because like, the more you look at someone else's or outside of your road or outside of your lane, the less you're focusing on your lane. right? And, it's interesting how your mind works, right? Because when you're comparing yourself, let's say, with another person, you're starting to paint the ideal picture of that person, right? In terms of, oh my gosh, that person has it great. That person probably found that product market fit very quickly. That person probably has, the most is the most happy, whatever it is, right? You start painting this mental picture of that perfect person, but in reality, that's not the case. Like for me, for example, I probably only know like 2 or 3 people like super closely, right? Like how do you even know like what the other person's thinking, right? So just to kind of like circle back, I'm thankful that, from the start, I was able to focus on like my lane and be able to dream and like not worry about what other people are doing or achieving. I wouldn't put too much pressure to almost expect yourself to get it right and understand everyone initially. I think like you're just gonna have to go through the emotions, right? But I think, as you go through kind of like these dealings and emotions, or these interactions, it kind of helps refine what values you care about, right? What's important to you, right? For example, like what's important to me is, integrity, right? Optimism, right? Being empathetic, right? Being, very kind of like, helpful and like inspiring, like, our boy Aaron here, right? So it's just like, the way I would approach it is kind of like, really think about what's important to you, right? Like what values are important to you. And admittedly, like, as I went on in my career, like those values kind of like, I honed in, I changed some of them, but then your interactions and your dealings with people in which intuitively you thought they were going to act a different way actually helps you refine your values even more, right? So hopefully that answers your question, but that's the way kind of I would look at that.
So let me I'm going to share advice from a mentor of mine that I think is just brilliant on the subject. He said that startups and entrepreneurs need to be, I'm paraphrasing here, but kind of slow to scale, fast to profitable. And he meant a couple things by that, and he did not mean a couple of other things. So to clarify, we're talking about startups like in the very earliest stages. Startups that are very much in the process of trying to figure out what their business model should be, who their customer is, what exactly their value proposition is. And the idea here is that you've got a lot to learn and to experiment with before you know exactly what it is you're building, what the processes are that you're going to be executing someday. When you don't know those things and you scale really quickly, you might scale in a direction that doesn't work, like the system might break. Maybe you can't build something profitably, or maybe customers are going to quickly decide they don't like what you're doing. But if instead you focus early on making sure you can build something that is profitable, you know that you can make money off it, right? That it can live on its own. So with that as the early ambition, the second that you can prove that you have a profitable business model, or even at least just a path to profitability, then you can go talk to some of your investors, potential investors. Like these are all things you're doing before investors have put money into your company. Then once you are profitable or have a clear path to profitability, that's when you can pour, the fuel on the fire, get some of that venture funding and begin to take off. Because certainly, ultimately, if you are going to be a venture-backed startup, then scale has to happen at some point. You do need to be able to grow big and as quickly as possible. But there's some steps that need to happen before you get there. So that's kind of my take on it. Like, try to figure out a way to be profitable as fast as possible. Try to do that while you're bootstrapping if you can, and then go gangbusters. And I don't know. I mean, again, you're the entrepreneur here. I'm just waxing philosophical. You tell me where I'm wrong or where I'm right.
I completely agree. I mean, I have honestly no further comments. I completely agree with your thinking here.
Awesome.
So, it's interesting, right? It's like, it's really important to have a support system, right? Some people around you that you can trust and that you can confide in and that you can really be yourself around, right? Because, it's interesting, right? Because as a leader, let's say, of a company, you have to have a certain demeanor, right? That being said, you still can be vulnerable, right, with your employees, but there's also a sense of leadership that you have to demonstrate, right? And at the end of the day, if you think about it, I think Colin Powell makes this one quote. He's like, how do you define a leader? It's like, someone who's going to basically follow you through kind of like I think it's like, I'm messing this up, but someone who's going to follow you through like an alley that's like dark, And like, if you think about it, all entrepreneurs at night literally are waking up around like 2:30 and 3 in the morning with like, not sweats, but like, a little kind of anxiety, right? And that's the reality of the matter. And, what you have to do is you have to find things that make your frequency internally, right, at peace and at kind of Zen level, right? Because the way you look at entrepreneurship is the following, right? So let's say you have like a frequency, and then, every single day something's going to come up, and then your frequency is going to be like, what? Well, it's going to be like, all over the place. But then what happens is it has to kind of get back to normal, right? So let's say you're at a normal frequency starting the day. Now something hits, now your frequency is like this. Now it's going to get back to normal, this, and now it's going to get back to normal. But imagine you're starting the day when your frequency is like this, and when something comes in, then your frequency is like this, and it's hard to go back to normal. So what happens then is you're actually making bad decisions. You're not making decisions or not operating under a frequency that you should be operating under, right? So to answer your question, to prevent yourself from hitting rock bottom, you have to, in my opinion, find and have a group of people, just like this group, for example, that you guys have, right? Be able to communicate honestly and candidly. And I think then you got to think about like some things that you really like to do, right? Like I love to run, right? So what I do is I'll run every single morning. And for me, it's almost like kind of like a meditation, right? To clear my mind such that like I can get my like frequency kind of back to normal. So you should expect to be in the trenches, right? When you're an entrepreneur, but just understand that also it's not life or death, right? So find a support system, do things that you love, and then always just have perspective that, hey, look, like, nothing is as bad as it ever seems, or nothing is as good as it ever seems, right? So just have perspective on that front.
Awesome. So Nitin, we're down to like our last 2 minutes here. So maybe if you don't mind, spend the last couple of minutes here explaining how in the world you ended up at Postmates in the first place. I think it's a story.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, started my second company, and then, grew that company, was in the process, of thinking about like, next steps in terms of raising money, Postmates, at that time, like then we thought about what we should do. And then we ended up partnering with Postmates. Right. And, I ended up, that deal ended up happening last year. And when you think about Postmates and when you think about Ferry, it's almost like logistics wise, they're very complex businesses, right? So, right now I'm just, at Postmates, really interesting market, right? Obviously, unfortunately, like, during COVID, it's at least, a lot of companies are suffering. Postmates, is, doing pretty well compared, or like, along with like Uber Eats and like, DoorDash, because people need food. So it's going to be interesting to just see how retail and the food industry now thinks about delivery as one of their, main business focuses, right? Because at the end of the day, right now, the only way you can get food is, essentially going on, these types of platforms. So over there, but in the meantime, trying to do everything I can to, help others, mentoring entrepreneurs, love working with Aaron and his team. So that's kind of where we're at.
Nitin, thank you much. We have officially hit 2:00, folks. So let's give Nitin a round of applause. Thank you for coming to Mentor Meetup at the Student Startup Center. That was spectacular. I hope everyone listening today aspires to follow in his shoes. We'll be doing our job at the SSC if that's what happens. So Nitin, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. And we'll catch you guys later.
Take care.